Have you ever paused long enough to ask yourself, if I only had a few years left, how would I truly want to live? After 60, many believe the work is done, that all that's left is rest. But rest without meaning becomes emptiness. And silence without reflection becomes regret. Dear one, age is not the end of the path. It is the opening of a deeper one, a path of presence, simplicity, and truth. The real journey doesn't begin when we are young and fast. It begins when we slow down and ask, what really matters now? In this video, we will walk through some of the most life-changing insights rooted in Buddhist wisdom, not just to help you age gracefully, but to help you live meaningfully. This is not just another video. It is a mirror, a lantern, a wake-up bell. So I invite you to stay until the very end. Let the stillness between these words speak to your soul. And if something touches you, even one sentence, leave a comment, subscribe to our channel, and help us spread this wisdom to those who are quietly searching, just like you. In our youth, time stretches endlessly before us, like a long highway disappearing into the horizon. We race forward, measuring life by the mile markers, graduations, careers, houses, marriages, and accomplishments. Each year is counted, and each success added like trophies to a growing shelf. We run faster, convinced that if we move quickly enough, we might outrun the fear of meaninglessness. But time has its own rhythm. And sooner or later, it begins to whisper, not through the ticking of clocks, but through the ache of the body, the quietness of an empty room, or the moment we forget why we walked into it. It was in Oregon, at a small Zen center surrounded by pine forests, that I met Carl, a retired firefighter, 79 years old. Every morning, just before sunrise, he would sit alone on a weathered bench at the edge of the retreat's grounds. The field before him was nothing extraordinary, just tall grass, morning mist, and the soft rustle of wind, but Carl sat as if the world were unfolding there. A thermos of black coffee in his hand, a wool cap pulled down to his eyebrows, he didn't speak much. But when he did, his words were like stones placed with care in a quiet garden. I used to run into burning buildings without hesitation, he told me one morning. Now I just sit and watch the fog roll in. And I finally feel alive. I looked at him, a man who had once faced flames, chaos, and urgency daily, now completely still, letting the world come to him. And I realized something the Buddha had long taught: we don't lose time because it moves too fast, we lose it because we are never truly there when it arrives. The trouble is not with time itself. Time has always flowed like a river, steady and patient. The trouble is that we try to live ahead of it, always planning the next moment, regretting the last, and rarely entering the one we're in. Carl spoke of his new practice, 10-second pauses. Before opening the refrigerator. Before answering the phone. Before stepping into the shower. Just 10 seconds to stop, breathe, and feel the moment. At first, he said, it felt strange. But now, he swears those tiny pauses are the reason his days no longer vanish like smoke. I used to try to make time, he said. Now I just try to meet it. There is no shortcut to this kind of awakening. No app or planner or schedule will give it to us. It begins in stillness, in the courage to do less, to move slower, and to pay fierce attention to the ordinary. I remember the Buddha's words, with mindfulness, time opens. And Carl, without knowing the scriptural text, embodied its truth. He told me that when he eats, he chews slowly. When he listens fully. And when he washes the dishes, he does it not as a chore, but as a meditation, hands in warm water, breath steady, attention anchored in that one simple act. Time, he said, has become friendly again. No longer a thief, but a quiet companion. And maybe that's what growing older is meant to teach us, not how to do more, but how to be more. To turn daily life into sacred ritual. To taste our tea as if for the first time. To watch the way sunlight dances on the floor. To hear the voice of a loved one as though it were music. When we live like this, each day expands. Each moment becomes textured, colored, and rich with meaning. Even silence feels full. Even waiting feels alive. So if you're reading this and wondering where the last decade went, if the months are blurring and the years seem to evaporate, know this: the doorway back into life is always open. And it requires no grand gesture, just one breath taken with your whole attention. Slow down. Not because you're old, but because you're wise enough now to know that nothing real can be rushed. And as we begin to walk more gently with time, something else begins to rise quietly within us, a question not of speed, but of substance. If I slow down, what truly matters now? What is worth giving my presence to? That, dear friend, is where we begin the next part of our journey, the sacred ground of human connection, where time and tenderness intertwine. Let us step into that together. And when we begin to slow down, when we finally allow ourselves to sit with time rather than chase it, something else begins to rise from within: memories. Not all of them sweet. Some come wrapped in silence, others in sorrow. We begin to feel the weight of conversations left unfinished, of people who slipped quietly out of our lives, not because they died, but because the silence between us grew louder than love. In Santa Cruz, during a late summer retreat, I met a woman named Ruth. She must have been around 75, soft-spoken and composed, with a steady presence like an old cedar tree. One evening, as the sun was melting into the ocean, she sat beside me and shared a truth that trembled in her voice. "I haven't spoken to my sister in over 30 years, she said. And I no longer remember the reason we stopped. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was something small that grew too large in the dark." She looked down at her hands, then out at the water, and whispered, "It's strange how heavy silence becomes when you carry it for that long." And I understood her. Because in this life, many people will walk beside us, some for a moment, some for decades, and it is easy to believe there will always be time to say what matters. But the truth is, a word left unsaid can weigh more than 1,000 spoken in anger. We often think that letting go of someone means we've healed, but sometimes, it only means we've learned to live with the ache. The Buddha once taught that we should not let unspoken words harden into stone within the heart. And yet, how many of us do? We avoid, postpone, justify. We wait for a sign, for the other person to make the first move. But healing doesn't begin with the other, it begins with the self. A single message, even one as simple as "I hope you're well," can begin to loosen the knots we've tied over years of silence. Ruth later told me she would write a letter, not because she expected a reply, but because something inside her needed to speak again. And perhaps that's what forgiveness truly is: not forgetting, not erasing the past, but choosing to stop holding our breath around it. There are people who live inside us long after they've left our lives. They linger in songs, in smells, in places. They come back in dreams. Sometimes we smile. Sometimes we look away. But rarely do we sit with them and say what needs to be said, even if only in prayer. Because forgiveness is not always a two-way path. Sometimes, it's a silent walk back to your own heart. And when we sit quietly with these echoes, not to dwell, but to witness, we begin to see relationships for what they truly are: not transactions, not obligations, but sacred grounds where our deepest lessons unfold. They teach us about attachment, about ego, about kindness, and about the parts of ourselves we still hide. Every person we've loved has been a mirror. Every goodbye, a teacher. Every silence, an invitation. So if someone comes to your mind as you read this, an old friend, a sibling, a partner, a child, don't ignore it. Don't wait for the perfect moment. The moment is now. Not because tomorrow is promised, but because presence is the only place where love still breathes. Even if the message is never returned, even if the apology is never heard, you will know, you reached back across time not with blame, but with tenderness. And in doing so, you soften the world by one silent weight. And as the heart learns to make peace with others, a quieter question begins to surface: what of this body that carries me? This aging form, slower now, marked by time, fragile in ways it never used to be, how do I love it, care for it, honor it, not as a tool, but as a temple? But that is a reflection we shall enter with even more gentleness. And once we have made peace with time, and with those we may have drifted away from, something even deeper begins to rise, a question that does not come from the mind, but from the soul. What truly matters to me now? It is not a question of productivity, or schedules, or goals. In the decades before, life felt like a constant answer to the next thing, the next meeting, the next responsibility, the next achievement. We lived by calendars, rushed through breakfasts, measured our days by what we accomplished rather than how we felt. But retirement, or simply growing older, removes the noise. The external demands fade. The applause quiets. And in the silence that remains, the question comes gently, but persistently: what is the meaning of my life, now that I no longer have to prove anything to anyone? At a retreat in Colorado last fall, I met an older gentleman named Michael. He had worked as an architect in Chicago for 40 years, raising a family, building a reputation, running at full speed. After retirement, he and his wife moved to the mountains for a slower life. But not long after, she passed unexpectedly. The house was quiet, the view was beautiful, and yet every day he felt adrift. I used to know who I was, he said to me during a tea circle. I was useful. I had purpose. Now, I just feel like I'm waiting. But over the course of the week, something in him softened. He began to rise early and sweep the temple porch, not because he had to, but because he wanted to offer care. He began making soup for the other participants. He sat next to newcomers in silence, simply sharing presence. On the last day, he smiled at me and said, "I thought I had to do something big to feel alive again. Turns out, it was just about giving myself to the small things, fully." And I understood what he meant. The Buddha never taught that we must change the world. He only taught that we must change how we show up in it. When we pour tea with mindfulness, when we sit with someone without checking our phone, when we write a letter by hand, or water a plant while humming softly, we are already shaping the world. Not on a grand scale, perhaps, but in ways that matter. Ways that ripple. We don't need a grand mission. We need sincerity. We don't need to be remembered. We need to remember what it feels like to be awake. So ask yourself again, not what must I do, but what brings my heart to life. Perhaps it's mentoring a younger neighbor, or reading stories to children at the library. Perhaps it's planting vegetables, not to harvest them faster, but to care for them lovingly. Perhaps it's calling someone just to say, "I'm thinking of you." We do not age out of purpose. We only outgrow the need to make it impressive. The true purpose of a human life, the Buddha reminded us, is not to collect, compete, or conquer, but to understand, to care, and to love, without needing applause for doing so. And when we begin to live that way, something remarkable happens. We no longer feel like time is slipping away. We feel as if we are finally stepping into it, barefoot, unguarded, real. Because presence, not productivity, is the deepest offering we can make to this world. And as that understanding begins to take root, a new reverence rises, not just for time, or people, or purpose, but for this very body we inhabit. Aging, yes. Slower, yes. But still capable of presence, of care, of love. Let us now turn our gaze toward this body, not as a burden, but as a sacred companion. A home that has carried us faithfully through every season of our becoming. And so, as we begin to live with more presence, more tenderness, more care for the small acts of daily love, we inevitably arrive at the place we have long avoided, this body. This fragile, faithful, aging body. We spend so many years ignoring it, criticizing it, pushing it to move faster, to look better, to be stronger. We speak to it with harshness, treat it like a machine, or worse, a burden. And yet, it never left us. It never turned away. Through every chapter of our becoming, this body has stayed. Through illness, heartbreak, sleepless nights, and long roads traveled, it has carried us, quietly, without applause. And now, as the skin begins to soften, as the joints stiffen, as the steps slow, this body is not failing us. It is simply inviting us to finally listen. I once met a retired nurse named Gloria at a retreat center in New Mexico. She was in her early 70s, recovering from a knee surgery, and walked with a slight limp. During walking meditation, I noticed how gently she moved, not with shame, but with reverence. One morning, she shared with a group, I used to be angry with my body for aging. But one day, I placed my hand on my chest and said, "Thank you. You never gave up on me. Even when I gave up on you." Her words landed in the room like a blessing. You see, the Buddha taught us that this body is not an enemy, it is our first teacher. It teaches us impermanence with every wrinkle, teaches compassion with every scar, teaches patience with every breath we struggle to catch. When we are young, we think the body is a tool. But in old age, we begin to realize it is a temple. And every temple deserves to be cared for, not because it is perfect, but because it is sacred. Instead of resenting the slowness, we can learn to move with it. Instead of hiding the pain, we can meet it with breath. One simple practice I offer to many elders is this: each morning, before you rise from bed, place your hand on your heart. Say softly, even silently, "Thank you, body. Thank you for staying." Let that be the first offering of your day. Not judgment. Not control. But gratitude. Because this body has held every grief you didn't know how to express. It has stored every joy, every heartbreak, every touch, every goodbye. And it is still here. Still yours. Still waiting to be loved. When we soften toward our bodies, we soften toward life. There is a kind of flowering that can happen in old age, not in the limbs, but in the spirit. A gentleness that wasn't possible when we were too busy. A ripening of wisdom that grows only in stillness. I have seen it in the eyes of those who walk slowly, but see deeply. In the smiles of those who no longer compete, but simply are. Let the body teach you how to live, slowly, with intention, with care. Because in the end, the goal is not to have a body that looks young, but a soul that feels free. And as we learn to inhabit this changing form with tenderness, we open ourselves to another miracle of later life, the quiet, patient return of creativity. Not the creativity of ambition, but of presence. A kind of making that is not about producing, but about offering. And that, dear one, is the next path we are about to walk. Shall we step into it, gently? And as we begin to dwell more gently within this aging body, as we speak to it with gratitude instead of demand, something else begins to stir quietly, the urge not to withdraw from life, but to share it. Not as an expert, not as a teacher, but as someone who has lived. Because true wisdom is not found only in books or teachings, but in the folds of everyday experience, in what we have touched, endured, forgiven, and learned to carry with grace. At a tea circle in Vermont, I once sat beside an elderly man named Thomas. He had never studied Buddhism formally, never attended long retreats. But there was a stillness about him, the kind that comes from having listened to life deeply. When someone in the group nervously asked, "What if I don't know enough to share?" Thomas gently placed his cup down and said, "You don't share what you know. You share what softened you." Those words have stayed with me ever since. We often think that in order to offer something meaningful to others, we must be fluent in doctrine, skilled in speaking, or approved by some authority. But the truth is, presence is enough. Presence that listens without trying to fix. Presence that stays when emotions get messy. Presence that holds space for someone else's pain, because you've known pain too. In Buddhist practice, this is called Dharma Sharing, but not the kind that happens behind a podium. It happens across kitchen tables, in slow walks with a friend, in handwritten notes sent without occasion. It happens when we say, "I heard something today that helped me. Maybe it will help you too." You do not need to quote the sutras to be a vessel of compassion. You only need to offer the truth of your lived experience, seasoned by silence, deepened by reflection, and delivered not from ego, but from empathy. And often, it's the smallest gestures that carry the greatest wisdom, the way you look into someone's eyes without distraction, the way you ask "How are you?" and really mean it. The way you pause in your own sorrow just to sit beside someone else in theirs. That is teaching. That is transmission. We teach best when we do not try to teach, but simply live with an open heart. I once knew a woman named Marjorie who lived alone in a small cabin near the woods of Northern California. She had no children, no formal role in any sangha, but every Sunday, she baked a fresh loaf of bread and left it on her neighbor's porch, a single mother of two struggling to make ends meet. She never included a note, never waited for thanks. When asked why she did it, she shrugged and said, "Because someone once did that for me." That, too, is wisdom, passed not through lecture, but through bread. So if you've lived decades filled with both beauty and ache, do not think your story is too simple to matter. You carry a library within you. And someone, somewhere, is waiting for just one page of it to help them find their way. You are not too old to inspire. You are not too quiet to be heard. You are not too ordinary to be sacred. And as we begin to see our own life not just as something that happened, but as something that can be shared, we find a deeper purpose blooming, not to impress, but to connect. Not to lead, but to accompany. And from this place, another quiet truth begins to rise, that rest, too, can be sacred. That we no longer need to burn ourselves out to feel worthy. That gentle energy, offered mindfully, is enough. That, dear friend, is the next teaching waiting just ahead. Shall we walk into it, softly? Dear one, life after 60 is not the closing chapter, it is the beginning of something more sacred. A time not for rushing, but for returning. Returning to yourself. To the questions that truly matter. When the world no longer demands you to perform, you are finally free to ask, how do I wish to live, not out of duty, but from the deepest longing of my heart? If you carry just one truth from this reflection, let it be this. You were not born to hurry through life. You were born to inhabit it, breath by breath, moment by moment. So begin again, with softness. Write one honest line in your journal. Call someone you've been holding in your heart. Sit quietly by a window and let the light fall gently across your hands. And in that silence, whisper to yourself, I am still here. And I can still live more deeply, starting now. If this message has touched something inside you, don't keep it to yourself. Leave us a comment, even just one word of how you're feeling right now. Subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and join us on this path of gentle awakening. And share this video with someone whose soul may be quietly longing for these words. Let us walk this journey together, not quickly, not perfectly, but wholeheartedly. You are not alone. You never were.